In this video, we'll discuss a statement made by Celso Amorim, an advisor to President Lula. He said that if the United States were to attack Venezuela, there's a risk of an Amazonian Vietnam emerging in South America. But could this really happen? This Monday, December 8th, Celso Amorim, President Lula's international affairs advisor, gave an interview to the British newspaper The Guardian. He issued a grave warning, stating that if the United States decides to attack Venezuela, there is, in his view, a real risk of South America becoming a kind of war zone. He described it as similar to a new Vietnam, only this time in the Amazon rainforest. According to Amorim, such an intervention could provoke not only a direct confrontation between the United States and Venezuela, but also trigger a popular resistance. He believes this resistance could even be capable of uniting Maduro's adversaries in an armed struggle against the United States. But does this Vietnam-like war scenario make sense in the context of Venezuela in 2025? To understand Amorim's analogy, it's worth recalling why the Vietnam War is so often cited when discussing guerrilla warfare, popular resistance, and a prolonged war. Among the main characteristics of that conflict were the jungle environment, the hostile terrain, and guerrilla warfare, with communist forces like the Viet Cong using guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and local knowledge. They made extensive use of support from the rural population to create a long, unpredictable, and bloody war of attrition. There was also strong foreign support for the communist side. Countries like China and the Soviet Union provided material support, weapons, and training. This guaranteed an international support structure that allowed the war to be prolonged for many years. There was also strong ideological polarization and massive popular support, with the North Vietnamese viewing the war as a nationalist and anti-imperialist resistance. And it was this combination, jungle plus guerrilla warfare plus external support plus popular backing, that made the Vietnam War a deep, unpredictable, and exhausting war of attrition. If South America were able to replicate this type of warfare with jungles, guerrillas, external support, and popular participation, Amorim's parallel would make sense. But in the case of Venezuela, the situation today is very different. This leads us to a crucial question. Why is a new Vietnam in Venezuela highly unlikely? Venezuela is indeed a country with vast regions of jungle and forest in the Venezuelan Amazon and in remote areas, but most of the population and infrastructure, including the military, is concentrated in urban areas. The Vietnam War was possible because the communist guerrillas had very strong, widespread rural popular support, which offered large, safe areas to camouflage themselves and hide materials, in addition to hostile territory controlled by communist forces. In Venezuela, there is no organized rural guerrilla movement with mass popular support, nor an isolated territory where the opposition or insurgents could safely hide with proper infrastructure. With the regime of dictator Nicolas Maduro limiting itself to controlling densely populated urban areas, it is hindering a more jungle-style, guerrilla-like insurgency as occurred in Vietnam. In other words, the terrain and geographical context do not currently favor a conflict in Venezuela like the one in Vietnam on a national scale. Another important element is the lack of robust and structured external support. In the Vietnam War, the support of China, Cuba, and the Soviet Union was crucial in sustaining the war. This support included weapons, training, logistics, supplies, and international diplomatic backing, allowing for prolonged resistance. But in the case of Venezuela in 2025, despite alliances with powers like Russia and China, or regional sympathies from some governments like Colombia and Cuba, there is no evidence of international networks of military and logistical support equivalent to what existed in Vietnam. Pay close attention. During that war, millions and millions of tons of weapons and ammunition flowed across the border into North Vietnam every year. But in the case of Venezuela, its neighbors, Colombia and Brazil, have neither the necessary means nor the willingness to do so, as they fear, and rightly so, commercial and even military reprisals from the United States. Cuba also doesn't have a surplus of weapons, and even if it did, it would have to go through the naval blockade imposed by the United States in the Caribbean, as would Russia and China. The global and regional landscape has changed. Today, there isn't a Cold War similar to the one from the Vietnamese era, with strongly opposed ideological blocs willing to invest heavily in a Latin American conflict. Therefore, that entire gigantic international support infrastructure that allowed the Vietnam War to be prolonged simply is not present in Venezuela today. Another major difference. In Vietnam, the communist guerrillas had broad and very strong popular support from peasants, rural workers, and urban sectors, sympathetic to the nationalist, anti-imperialist cause, all of them helping to sustain the war effort. In today's Venezuela, two realities contradict this kind of mobilization. The first being the 2024 presidential elections, which showed that around 67% of Venezuelans voted for Edmundo González, the opposition candidate to Maduro's dictatorship, demonstrating a lack of mass popular support for the Chavista regime, which only stays in power through fraud, violence, and persecution of the opposition. This rejection dramatically weakens the possibility of a mass popular mobilization to defend the dictatorship of Nicolás Maduro. In other words, unlike Vietnam, there is no broad and enthusiastic social support in Venezuela today to sustain a long-term conflict in Maduro's name. Finally, pragmatic factors make an Amazonian Vietnam unlikely, starting with the fact that South American countries in general have no interest today in a prolonged regional war. This means that some of these countries, notably Gustavo Petro's Colombia, despite showing sympathy and support for Maduro, would be very unlikely to act concretely in his favor precisely because they fear a long war and, of course, direct reprisals from the United States. All of this shows that the combination of factors necessary for a Vietnam-type war with robust external support, organized guerrillas, popular support, and favorable terrain does not exist in its entirety in Venezuela today. In short, Amorim's warning may be a risk alert, but the analogy with Vietnam is, at the very least, a great exaggeration. Celso Amorim calls attention to the danger of an external military intervention and the risks of regional destabilization, something that, in fact, must be considered very seriously. And an armed conflict in Venezuela could generate severe political, humanitarian, and migratory consequences for all of South America. But when analyzing the real conditions in Venezuela now, it's difficult to envision the materialization of a war in the style of the Vietnam War. If anything were to happen, it would probably be an internal political and institutional crisis, with instability, protests, and some armed groups scattered in the forest. But it would be more like a Fox-style guerrilla war in restricted, localized areas, rather than a Viet Cong-style war on a national scale.